everyone. Welcome to our Q&A Cafe for ByDesign today. Our topic is how do general ledger determinations work in ByDesign? So today we have Alex Waddell. He'll be hosting, and myself, Kayla, will be facilitating this webinar. I will be recording the session starting right now for learning purposes, so I will have everyone on mute for the duration of the webinar. I encourage you to type your questions in the chat or question window so we can address them after the presentation portion of this webinar. One last thing before we start, we are now holding these ByDesign Q&As weekly on this day and time, so please go to our resources page and scroll to the bottom where you can see the next few weeks of webinars with the registration links. The next one is on preparing a liquidity forecast in ByDesign, and that's next week on Wednesday. So without further ado, I'll mute myself and I'll pass it over to Alex.
Thank you, Kayla. So welcome everybody. It's good to be here for the next half hour to an hour, depending how many questions come up. I'm happy to talk about the general ledger determinations in SAP ByDesign, which have a little bit of complexity. I'm going to assume that people have a basic understanding of creating chart of accounts and getting into the business configuration to make these changes, but I will run through, we'll create a sample one so you can kind of see how it works. But we'll try and get into a little bit of under the hood so you can sort of try and get an understanding of maybe why SAP has created sort of a complex looking engine for setting up your general ledger determinations. So with that, I'm just going to dive right in. So I'm logged into our enablement environment, which is probably something you've all seen before. It's the Acron, Innovat companies that we demo. This environment, I think I actually have a couple of chart of accounts, so this makes the GL determinations even a little bit more sophisticated. So that may or may not be a scenario that you're looking at in your system. So to get to my GL determinations, most of you are probably still running first implementation project. So I'm just going to go into that project and open it up there through the activity list. Otherwise, you get to it through the overview of your business configuration. Inside the open activity list, I just search on the word chart to get to it quickly. And this is sort of the parent for a whole bunch of activities around creating chart of accounts, financial reporting structure. So when you launch this menu, you get into a sub-screen, which takes you into fairly robust settings around your GL determinations that are all associated to each other. So of course, how we're tying in a piece of master data to a specific general ledger, or how we're tying in a specific choice on the user side into a GL account is all governed by what you're doing inside these screens. So you're linking a GL determination group to a specific GL account. So there's really, I guess, three elements to that. There's maintaining the list of GL chart of accounts. That's very straightforward. There is creating the groups, which are essentially the bucket or the name of the variable that we're giving that particular GL determination. And then there's the linkage itself of the prior two, so the GL account to the group. The reason they're not done in the same screen is because many GL determinations have a many-to-one relationship. So for example, if we are setting up a GL determination for banking, it's not just linking the cash account, it's linking the clearing account. So there's multiple GL accounts that may be associated depending on the type of group. So let's have a look at an example of that. If we start with the chart of accounts, what's important in the chart of accounts to the GL determinations is this last column here, which is the GL account type. So a lot of people believe that this really relates to your financial reporting. Not so much. It really relates to how the system knows that this account is available to which GL determination group. So as a simple example to that is cash here. We have, it looks like about 8, oh, there's another couple down here. So we have various accounts that we have flagged as relating to cash, and therefore they are eligible to the cash determination group. So each one of these GL account types will tie to different GL determination groups. The vast number of them that are categorized are really around the balance sheet. Once you get down to your P&L, It's really just your revenue accounts, and then everything else is your costs and expenses. So most of your accounts for your simple GL determinations for your cost expenses all have this one category, so that can be quite a lengthy list. And then of course, when you get below the line, you get to your difference accounts and things like that, which could be a little bit more unusual. So let's look at an example of that. So just keep in mind that we had about 8 or 9 cash flagged accounts. So now I'm going to go into my edit account determination groups, and we're going to look at how the groups are organized in this screen. So they are organized with a relationship to a subledger. So on the left side of the screen, you see all the various subledgers. On the right side of the screen, you see the specific GL determination groups that you are able to create in the system. So I'm going to jump right to the cash one because that's a nice clean example to look at. So in our cash determination group, out of the box, I recognize these as SAP's cash determination groups. They're called Bank 1, Bank 2. As part of the configuration in your system, likely we or you rename these to something more specific like Bank of America or whatever bank that you actually use, so that it's a little bit clearer when you create the relationship to your master data. So how does that relationship with your master data work? That's always just inside the master data setup. So for whatever piece of data we're looking at. So if I go down to my liquidity management and we go to our banks, I can open up bank accounts for Bank of Cleveland here, and I can see that I've got 2 different accounts, and my choices for account determination are derived from that list on the previous screen. So I've got Bank 1 and Bank 2. So as of this current configuration, I only have the ability to link to 2 different bank GL account determinations. If I were to go back to my account determinations and look at something like accounts payable, that's another one that's straightforward. So I recognize some of these as out of the box with SAP, domestic third party, foreign third party, domestic affiliated. Any ones that start with a Z or a Z are created by us because SAP has prescribed that they are reserving the usage of the numbered categories. All the ones that you create have to start with Z in order that SAP never overwrites them should they ever expand this list. So anytime you see a Z, you know that was one that was custom built for this specific environment. So how do we get to that master data? Because this is payables, I'm going to go to my supplier base, go into my suppliers. So if we open up any supplier in the system, I can just go right to the financial data tab. And as part of setting up the supplier in the system, it's incumbent upon that user to associate which company that supplier is allowed to do business with. So in this case, it's Almica. And then this dictates how the GL account is going to be governed. It's going to be driven to the GL associated with domestic third party. If we were looking at an employee supplier, it might be associated to this account determination group. If we were looking at the intercompany supplier, it would be associated to this group. And so on and so forth. So each one of these will have a similar experience, probably in the master data, likely in the financial data tab, but not necessarily as you saw with banking, but it's going to be somewhere in the setup of that single master data item where you have the ability to tie that object to the GL determination group. Now in the system, if I want to create a new GL determination group, I can just hit the add row here. Actually, let's do it on the cash one. So let me click on that. And so it's telling me the same thing, that I have to do a Z number, so it doesn't really matter what I use. But let's say I wanted to set up Bank of America. I want to specify that this is a bank account, and then I'm going to save that. Actually, sorry, I think I got an error because I inserted a row here, so let me get rid of that, and I'm going to save this. And this takes a minute to save because it's updating the tables. But once that piece of data has saved, then that GL determination group is available for associating to accounts. And it's also available with inside the master data element. Doesn't matter which order you go in, but until you have GL accounts associated to it, you can't really invoke a transaction without getting an error. So what that means is even right now, I should in theory be able to go, I might have to refresh this screen, so I'm just gonna close that and assume that I need to. Go into my liquidity management, go to my banks. Let's open up, I'm gonna just cheat and open up an existing bank rather than setting up Bank of America. And now you can see that I have Bank of America as a new GL determination. So I could, in theory, now set up a new bank account. And of course, how you name this could be anything. Maybe I really should have created this as Bank of Cleveland Savings, something like that, because that's potentially the type of thing I would do is create a new savings account or a new investment account, and I want to drive that to a different GL. So that's creating the group, that's associating it to the master data. Now let's talk about how the accounts are linked to it. So we're going to go back to our master list here, and all of those account determination linkages are performed under this menu called account determination. So I'm going to jump directly into the cash one. And in here at the top half of the screen, you have the association with a particular chart of accounts. So this environment has two chart of accounts, which gives you an idea of a bit more of a complex setup. Many of you may be running off of a single chart of accounts, so you won't really have to worry about what's going on the top half. If you do have multiple chart of accounts, especially if they relate to consolidated sets of books, then it's potentially possible that your GL determination has to be maintained in multiple chart of accounts. So keep that in mind. In this particular case, I'm just going to go look at my USA one. So here's where I can see the previously set up account determinations. And now this is the field that's not grayed out. So this is where I have it associated to a specific chart of accounts identifier. So this is telling me that bank one goes to this GL account, bank two goes to this bank account. If I want to add a row here, presuming I've created a new group, so it's available in this dropdown, I can now select it, my Bank of America. And then when I invoke this list, I do not get my entire chart of accounts. I'm only going to get those 8 or 9 accounts from my chart of accounts, which were flagged as cash. So depending on which subledger you're in, you're only going to get that list of accounts. And this is why it's important to take note when you're setting up a new GL account, what that account type is. If you're mapping it to GL determinations, that's going to be important. So I neglected to set up a Bank of America account. I could just link this to another GL account. That's probably not a real life scenario. But then I have to make my way through these other tabs because as I was saying, one single GL determination is going to govern different events depending on the type of subledger. So when you think about a cash account, you've got your true cash, but you also have a clearing account for your cash receipts. So in this particular case, Bank 1 and Bank 2, they are using the same cash receipt clearing account, which is totally fine. That's up to your discretion how you want to set that up. When it comes to cash disbursements, so we cut a check from the system, it's going to relieve payables and it's going to credit your cash disbursement account until your bank is reconciled. So that could also be a common account across all your banks. If we go to check deposits, same thing here. It's just a single clearing account, petty cash, foreign exchange. So now we have gains or losses. Where do we want those to go? And then you'll see that some cases, it's not giving us the opportunity to associate it to a GL determination. So the assumption here is that it doesn't matter which bank account, it's going to always use a common foreign exchange gain or loss accounts. So it is important when you go in here to understand the subledger that you're updating, what the types of transactions are, so that you are aware of all the different GL accounts that you need. Now, there's two ways to get to your different subledger. Inside that activity list, you had, that's not going to show until I pop it up. You had that list of subledgers, but you can also change your subledgers by clicking this drop down here, and that gets you to the screen the same way. So it's just going to change the lower half of your screen. Now we can see that if we're looking at the accounts payable subledger, we already talked about, or I showed you that there was domestic, foreign, third-party employees. And here's where we're setting up the GL determination for each one of those particular types of accounts. Now, in this particular case, payables also has a bunch of events. So it has in transit. So what does that mean? It means our goods receipt process has an unbilled payable side, or actually it's purchase in transit, and then it's unbilled payables when you do the AP invoice. So that's how those clear. If you're using the bad debts feature in the system to how to reclassify things, you might need those accounts. So all depends on what you're utilizing in the system. You may or may not have to populate accounts. So potentially if your system is all in one currency, you may never have to worry about gains or losses. So it is potentially possible in your system that these columns are blank or some sort of defaults, and that's absolutely fine if things are working the way you expect them to. There's no problem with that. And then another thing to keep in mind is if we go look at something like inventories, which is also fairly complex. So these are the GL determination groups that you would associate with all of your inventory master data items, which in this system are categorized into 5 broad categories from your balance sheets perspective. So your raw materials, your supplies, semi-finished, all the way up to your trade goods, indicating what GL account you want them to go into. And in some cases, you can see here that work in process. So if you're doing a manufacturing event, then we would have a work in process transaction potentially triggered where it's going to temporarily be in this GL account. So when I look at this configuration, I can see that raw materials is not something I would ever manufacture. Therefore, I do not need to associate a GL account to this. And in fact, I probably want to leave this blank so that I know if somebody accidentally sets up master data incorrectly and creates raw materials when it should have been finished goods, and then they try and trigger a manufacturing event, they're going to get an error on their screen saying GL determination is missing. So keeping these fields blank or populated is another way that you can put preventative controls in your system to make sure that your subledgers are behaving the way that you intend them to. So inventory has a lot of different GL determination events. As you're looking at all of the ones relating to differences, you can see each column supports a different GL account. You may or may not decide to take advantage of that. If you hover over the question mark, it'll give you a description of what it is that event, or what event it is that's triggering this GL account. Sometimes this is not completely clear. If you have any questions about these, you're free to reach out to us, and we can help you explain when this event would occur. But for example, this one's pretty straightforward. Production differences occur when the actual production costs differ from the inventory price. So that has to do with standard cost manufacturing, if there's different gains or losses. In those cases, the system supports you having a different GL account from a loss versus a different GL account from a gain. So that also gives you the flexibility to create very dynamic chart of accounts, but you do not always have to use a different account. That's completely up to you. So you'll see in some cases here, loss from purchasing differences and gains from purchasing differences. We're using the exact same GL account, 450210, 450210. We're not interested in really differentiating gains or losses on our income statement in that case. So once again, that's just a design decision from your perspective. What accounts are available to us? These are all ones that in the chart of accounts have a specific account type which relate to differences. That was one of the options that you could choose. Okay, I'm going to, actually, let's talk a little bit about the different chart of accounts. So if you are using multiple chart of accounts with multiple sets of books, do remember that you are going to have to maintain. So if you do create a new GL account with a new GL determination, you are going to potentially have to remember to do it in both charts of accounts. I do see people forget that once in a while, and that gets to be a little bit tricky, or you may not realize why the system is throwing you an error. So you're trying to create some sort of a journal voucher for intercompany, let's say, which is now potentially impacting two different charts of accounts. And when you do that, the system is throwing an error, you go in and it looks fine. Just remember that maybe the receiving company is using a different chart of accounts. And so now you're going to have to replicate adding a row, adding that account determination that you've created, and using the GL account specific to that company. Okay, so I'm going to go back to our GL determinations and talk a little bit about where GL determinations are used in the system outside of the master data, because the master data is quite straightforward. You create a new supplier, you're going to link that supplier to a GL determination that's going to drive, what the AP liability account is. You create a new customer, you're going to use a GL account to associate what the GL determination is for that asset. The same with cash, the same with tax. Where it gets to be a little bit confusing is in some of the transaction-based data. So what may or may not be apparent to end users is how often they're using GL determinations and not really realizing it. One of those examples is in costs, which are commonly invoked in an AP invoice. So if I go into my supplier invoicing and I want to create a new invoice, going to choose a supplier. I'm going to go down to my row and I'm going to put in, whatever it is, my description. There's a number of different ways that the supplier invoice could be determining the GL account. How it is being determined for you today depends on how your system is configured. If you are not clear how it's working, or you don't think it's working properly, or you think it could be working more efficiently, that's another way that another reason for you to reach out to us so that we can help you understand that, because this is fairly complex. So when we're dealing with these transactions, whether it's the invoice or the purchase order, at the line level, we know that the liability side is being controlled by the GL determination associated with the supplier, but the offsetting debit is being governed by something that you're entering into the transaction itself. So if you are entering a specific material product, like let's say we are buying some item in our item master list, that item could be governing the GL determination. However, you could leave the product blank, which is what I'm going to do here, and you can select a product category. So if you have not selected a product and instead you put a product category, let's say travel, then the system could be governing, and in this particular case, I can tell it's not because I'm already getting an error telling me there's no account determination set up for this product category. So right away, that's a configuration that was not completed in this test environment. Let me just check another one on the off chance that something is set up. It looks like this one might be set up. So if I do office supplies instead, I'm going to assign this to a cost center because I know that is going to be required for a P&L entry. And if I try and simulate this journal entry, sorry, rookie mistake there. I forgot to put that in the wrong column. So let's just hit the check button, make sure I'm actually good here. And non-taxable. Oh, goodness. Okay, my supplier is not associated. Let me see if it'll simulate. Probably not. Okay. So if I simulate this journal entry, I'm going to see a debit, ideally to some sort of office supplies, so material consumption. So that's what's associated to that particular product category. Whether that makes sense in this kind of wonky test environment, you could argue, but that is how it's come up with that account because of what is associated to this particular GL determination associated to this product category, and I can show you that in a moment. If I were to change this to another one that has a different GL account, then obviously the GL account would change. Now, in addition to that, a lot of AP users may go down here to actually select the account determination based on a GL account instead. So I could actually choose something completely different, like let's say lodging. So now it's going to travel expense. So despite the fact that I had a GL determination associated with this product category, the system is taking first priority from the GL account that was specifically selected here. Now, something else that might be a little bit invisible to the users is even though this says GL account, they are not technically selecting a GL account. What they are selecting here is a GL determination. That's obvious in this test environment because these are SAP's out of the box GL determinations and they all start with an alpha. And as you saw in the chart of accounts, our GL accounts are actually numeric. So our lodging account is in fact 500, 300 travel expense. So your first question may be, well, why is my GL account not actually a GL account? Why is it a GL determination? So the reason that SAP does that is because of the ability in the system to associate multiple charts of account, chart of accounts, multiple sets of books. So we do have some clients where their parent head office may have a completely different chart of accounts. And so the user selecting lodging here may actually generate two journal entries, one in the main chart of accounts, like in the main currency, and then another one in a parent organization. And so in fact, this GL determination A7110 could be associated to two different GL accounts in different sets of books. And things get a little bit confusing there, but once you sort of wrap your head around that concept, it'll kind of start to make sense. So let's go back to our chart of accounts and let's look at the account determination groups for all of those expenses. And that's under this category called costs, and then it's general expenses. So here's that same list that we just invoked on that AP invoice. So there's our A7110. And you'll see that this one has a slightly different view on the right side. So our cash account was not nearly so robust. So each subledger has different behaviors. So when it comes to our costs, we also have the ability to determine which specific cost documents do we want this GL account to be available in. So in this case, we can make this available in the supplier invoice. If we're using petty cash, we can have it available in the petty cash dropdown. If you're using bank transfers, outgoing checks, things like that, where you import a bank statement and that bank statement has some sort of expense on it that you want to drive directly to a GL account, this is how you determine that list of GL accounts that are available on that list. Other transactions, so if you're doing an intercompany journal entry, that's where you want those accounts to be available. And then this final one is receipt type configuration, refers to expense report tracking. So if you are using the expense module in ByDesign, this is how the system would associate those. So those look pretty logical to me. Wages, travel expense, lodging, meals, those are things you may put on an expense report, but chances are you don't put duties, insurance, freight on an expense report. So that's why these boxes are configured in that way. So this allows you to set up a single GL determination that's actually governing multiple transactions in different ways. Now let's leave this screen and go over to where we associate the GL account. So we're going to go into our subledger for the cost. And we're going to go to our general expenses variety. And you're going to see that this one doesn't have a whole lot of other columns. There's one for input taxes. I'm not going to get into that today. So for the general expenses, this is where you can see that our lodging was associated to that 500, 300 account. Same thing with this other GL determination. So you can in fact have a many-to-one relationship. You could have more GL determinations here than you have GL accounts. I will just mention, because some people have asked me this in the past, Can they create more GL determinations and then do reporting based on the GL determinations and have less accounts cluttering up their chart of accounts? The answer to that is pretty much no. I haven't found a lot of meaningful financial reports that have account determinations available as a reportable field. So I don't see a ton of value in doing this. The only reason you might do this is because it might make it a little bit easier for your AP staff to code things, to say, okay, I'm just going to put, oh, this is travel, this is transportation. If it's just easier, but as far as from a financial perspective, you're all putting it into the GL accounts. That's the only reason you might break it out, is just from a coding perspective, if you're worried they're going to call you and say, I'm missing a GL account. So I mentioned the multiple chart of accounts. This is why we have a GL determination being selected in the AP invoice and not a specific GL account. So if I were to go, for example, between my IFRS and my US chart of accounts, in this particular case, these chart of accounts are actually using the same numbers. So this is not really a meaningful example, but I could, in fact, as I'm invoking this list, I'm actually invoking a different chart of account. So these could, in theory, be completely different numbers. And they could also be aggregated completely differently. So if one of these chart of accounts were for, a parent organization that were not interested in reporting at the same level, this would be another situation where potentially on one chart of accounts, you're breaking things out at a great level of detail. You're separating meals and travel and other travel related expenses separately, but on your parent chart of accounts, maybe they're all going into one aggregate chart of account, GL account. So that's what this number allows you to do. Now, I would say many of you are not in this situation where you have multiple chart of accounts. I'm going to go back to this GL account determination screen one more time to our where we set up the groups. And when we look at those cost account groups, I mentioned before, like if we're setting up a new cash account, you have to follow this standard of creating it with a Z. When you go to the costs, SAP actually lets you create GL accounts that start with a number here. And I believe the reason that they do that is because they will allow you to create a GL determination group that is actually your GL account number. Most of us are using numeric GL accounts, not alphanumeric. So I would say many of our clients have set up, or we have set up on their behalf, their actual GL account number in here, so that when the user goes to create the invoice, instead of seeing a bunch of A's, they may already know that wages 510100 is the number. And then we would hide all of these A numbers, which are the out-of-the-box determinations that SAP provides us. We would hide those, and then you would just select a GL account. So in that case, it's still a GL determination, but that's invisible to the user. The user may believe they are selecting a GL account, but they are in fact selecting a GL determination, which is now mapped to the matching number on the GL side. And that is important to understand, because if you are going to create a new expense account in your system, it's not as simple as going into your chart of accounts and just creating the GL account. You now have to also come into your account determination groups, and you're going to have to create the group ID that matches. And then once you do that, you're going to have to go into your costs for your account determinations, and you're going to have to go to that appropriate tab for the general expenses, which is mapping the GL determinations for that. And there's our 50100, and you're going to have to map it to the new account that you've created. So keep that in mind. It's a lot of steps. Those steps may seem redundant and pointless, and they probably are redundant and pointless if you're only working in an environment with a single chart of accounts. But unfortunately, they're necessary to support that the system is more robust and could be supporting multiple charts of accounts and multiple sets of books. So we're at 12:35. I think what I'm going to do is just pause talking for a minute and see if Kayla has gathered any questions. If there are questions, I can dig in deeper. If people want to get into specific scenarios, I'm happy to address that. So Kayla, are there any questions that have come up out of this?
There are no questions at this time. I'd like to remind everyone that you can put your questions in the questions box or the chat box, and I can see them here. But yeah, there's no questions at this time, Alex.
There's no questions, and I've done such an amazing job of explaining this. It's totally clear. Or I've done such a terrible job that nobody is following what I'm talking about.
I think it's the first,
You
the
think it's
first
the
one.
first?
Yeah.
Okay. Uh, well, let me just give it a minute. Maybe while people, and I do encourage you to ask questions because I'm sure people are, if this is the first time you're looking at it, you must have questions. Or even if you've been doing this for a while, um, I'm happy to hear feedback of what's working or what's not working, or if there's anything that I've missed explaining. One thing that I haven't talked about is that product category mapping GL determination. So for those are also under the costs. You can map product categories through two means. You can create a product category that you deem to be a service, or you deem it to be a material. So for example, if you're setting up a product category for office supplies, you could decide that office supplies um, is a material, because maybe that's less confusing to the buyers. When they start to create the PO, they have to choose whether they're buying a material or a service. Um, or you could just say that because it's non-inventory, we create it as a service. That's pretty common. So you'll see here that this is where we create or associate the GL accounts to the service category. So I have a service category here for travel expense, 500. It's associated to my 500, 300. So you'll recall when I did that one AP invoice, I had an office expense. So it's probably actually linked to one of these other ones because I think it was coming up as service expense. I can't remember on that journal entry. This is a really sloppy test environment. But where is that then associated? You have to actually back out of your account determination. And there's a specific determination screen where you map together your product categories and these GL determinations that you've then created. So that's called default account determination group for product categories. So if you go in here, this is where you can see those associations. So as I mentioned, you can create it as a material, you can create it as a service. I think the system actually lets you create it as both, which maybe then gives you the supplier less chance of making an error. But the material determinations are a little bit trickier to set up, and I'm not going to get into the reasons why right now. So we typically recommend, if you're buying true inventory, it's not the product category that's determining it, it's the material asset itself, so it has nothing to do with this screen. If you're buying non-inventory, then just do it as a service. So if I want to take one of my product categories, like I've already got office expense, but let me take something like, what haven't I done? Marketing materials. Then I would just go over here and I could link it to whatever I've set up in those services. So I didn't set up an account determination for marketing materials, so I'm just going to be lazy and link it to this one called services, and then save that. So now if I invoke this product category on an AP invoice or on a purchase order, it's going to drive it to whatever GL account is associated with these services, which brings us to the point of accuracy. So if it's not dawning on you already, it's really critical that you have those accounts linked properly. In a case like this, where we've got multiple linkages, we've got an account linked to a determination, and then we've got an account determination linked to a product category. So there's two different places where you could potentially make an error. I could have the wrong GL account associated with this account determination group. I could have the wrong account determination group linked with the wrong product category, like I have done here. And it could be a while before you start noticing a problem, right, on your income statement. As you're buying marketing materials, it might not be until somebody's doing a budget analysis or some sort of income statement analysis that they go, how come marketing materials is sort of out to lunch? And then you trace it back and realize that, okay, somebody made a mistake, either associated the wrong account or the wrong account determination. And now all of those historical items have gone into the wrong account. If I fix it, like for example, go in and fix the GL account, change it here, it's only going to impact any new transactions I create. So you have to think about, I'm going to now have to journalize my history, assuming you want to do that. And if the account determination error was on something more significant than P&L, like let's say your cash, your accounts payable, accounts receivable, I definitely recommend you open a ticket with us and have us discuss with you what the implications are. So if you, for example, you've been creating intercompany entries into the wrong due to due from account, it's not just a matter of fixing the history because now there's subledger transactions associated with it. So we'd want to discuss a strategy for making those changes. So definitely you want whoever is doing the work inside the account determination to really understand this well, to be trained well. We're happy to give you additional training on this or review your work before you create these, especially when it relates to the balance sheet. Any mistakes there could be very difficult to correct.